everyone, and welcome to Nudgestock. Today, in my quick 20-minute talk, I want to give you some evidence-based tools that you can use to feel a little bit happier. This is a talk about nudging yourself. And it's called Psychology in the Good Life because that's built off the class that I teach here at Yale University. I've been teaching at Yale for over a decade, but in just the last couple of years, I took on a new role where I became a head of college on campus. So I'm hanging out with students really in the trenches. And I was really struck by the way that students are living right now. Like, students in college right now are just not as happy as I remember them being. And just so you can get a sense of how bad this is, here are just some really awful statistics about college student mental health. This is from a recent national survey back in 2017, but it's a really dire situation. So over 40% of college students report being so depressed it's difficult to function. Over 50% say that they feel hopeless most of the time. Over 60% say that they experience overwhelming anxiety, which is like the highest level of anxiety you could basically report on the scale. Over 60% say that they feel very lonely. And over 80% feel that they're constantly overwhelmed by all the things they have to do. So probably you're seeing these statistics the same way I did in the trenches in college, which is to say this is really bad. Some of you listening may have students who are about to go to university. Some of you may be hiring students who are leaving university. And that's your incoming workforce, where 40% of people are too depressed to function and 60% say that they're overwhelmingly anxious. So we at universities really need to think about ways to do something about this. And like all the other talks at Nudgestock, I thought that the best way to deal with this would be to take more of an evidence-based approach. And so I actually had a lot of hope at how to deal with this crisis. And that hope came from the science, the behavioral science. Even though we know lots and lots about behavioral economics and how we can nudge behavior, we actually know a lot about how we can nudge behavior in the context of making people happier. And a lot of this work comes from a field known as positive psychology, basically taking a scientific approach to happiness. What researchers do is they go out and find happy people. They're out there at Nudgestock in general, all over the workforce. You can find them. And then researchers can just ask the question, okay, what is making these happy folks so happy? What behaviors do they have? What salaries do they have? What are they doing? And from insights like that, we actually know a lot about the kinds of things that really work to make people happy, these evidence-based practices that actually work, and some of the stuff that we often think works but doesn't. And so I decided to put together a whole new class for Yale students on all these topics. I kind of christened it Psychology in the Good Life. And importantly, it was going to be a class that had two distinct parts. And those parts are going to be really important as you think about how to put these things into practice in your own life and into practice in your workplaces. One of the parts is just the scientific part. That's what you're going to hear about today. All these studies about what you can really do to feel a little happier. But there's a second part, which is that you need to put those scientific thoughts and these scientific insights into practice. We actually need to do the stuff that scientists are telling us. And this is pretty critical. It gets to one of my favorite cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are a happy thing to be talking about in Nudgestock. But my favorite one is one that I christened with my colleague Tamar Gendler here at Yale University. It's called the G.I. Joe fallacy. Now, I'm not sure if all the listeners of Nudgestock know what G.I. Joe is, but it is in fact this G.I. Joe. This is a terrible American cartoon from the 80s about army guys. No one really remembers the cartoon, but they remember how it ended. Because at the end of every G.I. Joe episode, kids heard this public service announcement where they learned something new to do. And they said, "Thank you, G.I. Joe. Now I know." And then G.I. Joe said this very famous phrase at the end. They said, "And knowing is half the battle." And it would go, "G.I. Joe," if you remember the cartoon. But in any case, this is what we think, that knowing is half the battle. Once we know stuff, we're good. But decades of work in behavioral economics and cognitive science has shown us that that's not the case. That is a fallacy, a bad one. Knowing is not half the battle. We need to select different situations. We need to find ways to engage our behavior differently. That's where behavior change really comes from. And so I didn't want my students to fall prey to the G.I. Joe fallacy. So I did something special. Instead of just the normal course requirements, I also gave students course rewirements, which were practices that were there to rewire students' habits. All kinds of things I'm going to be talking to you about in a second that really work. I kind of slapped those things into the syllabus so that students had to do them. And so that's a sort of quick story of the class. But what was shocking was what happened next, which is that I put the whole class together assuming 40 or so people would show up. And so you can imagine my surprise when I walked into a classroom that looked like this. This is what it looks like when a quarter of the entire Yale College population decides to take your class. 1 out of every 4 students, over 1,000 students came in. And I think this shows us a couple things. One is that students are voting with their feet. They don't like this culture of feeling stressed and overwhelmed, and they really wanted to do something about it. But also that students are ready for these evidence-based approaches. They wanted to know what behavioral science really said. They didn't want platitudes. They wanted to know what they could really do that science supports to make them happier. And so that's kind of a quick introduction to where this class came from and where some of these tips come from. Now I'm going to give you the 15-minute crash course in what students learn in this class, which is pretty fun because you don't have to go back to Yale, you don't have to pay the Yale tuition, just kind of get the whole crash course for free. But we have to pare it down a bit to a very quick listicle. And that listicle is going to be the top 5 insights that students get in the class. And so the first insight, which is one that's very important for this crowd in particular, all about the ways our minds are lying to us, is that that's a spot where we need to pay attention in the field of happiness too. The research suggests that our minds are lying to us a lot about the sorts of things that make us happy. And so, what are some domains where our minds are lying to us? Because it's kind of a weird concept, even for folks at Nudgestock. But, of course, we know there are lots of domains where we are just biased. Our minds work a lot like this visual illusion works, where we have this incredibly strong intuition. If you're watching this over Zoom right now, hopefully you're seeing that these circles appear as though they're moving a little bit. This is the shepherd's snake circles, and they're not moving. This is not an accident of my GIF. I'm not playing some sort of trick on you over video. It's a trick of your visual system. You see these circles as moving when in fact they are actually stationary. And that's just a feature of our mind. But what the research shows is that this is the case for many domains in cognitive science, but it's also the case in terms of what will make us happy. We as humans have incredibly strong intuitions about the stuff that's really going to work to make us feel better. We double down and we work a lot on those things so that we can get them. And then it turns out our intuitions are completely wrong. We're putting effort into making ourselves happy with features of our life that aren't going to matter for our well-being at all. What are some domains where our minds are lying to us about happiness? Well, the big one is this stuff, money. Most of us implicitly think that if we got a lot more of this stuff, we would be happier. But the data really suggests that that's probably not the case, at least for a lot of the folks listening to this. Some lovely studies by Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton back in the day showed that in the US right now, if you're earning over 75K, then doubling or tripling your salary isn't going to reduce your stress levels, your negative, your positive. It's not going to increase your positive emotion, and it's not going to decrease your negative emotion. Like the effect of money on our well-being is just not what we think once you get above a certain range of money. And that's true not just for money, but true of the things that money can buy. Sometimes we think that if we could just get this amazing new house or like a really nice car, we'd feel better. Turns out the data suggests there is a correlation between materialism and happiness, but it's a negative correlation. In other words, the more you actually seek out material goods, in fact, the less happy you wind up being. And so this is something we need to come to terms with in these and other domains. We really believe that there are certain things that will make us really happy, but in practice, those things simply don't make us as happy as we think. And therefore, there's this path to happiness. This is why I start my talk with this image here. There's kind of a path to happiness that we can take. We can create it and nudge ourselves into it, but we need to know the right things to do. And so the question is, what are those right things to do? That's what the rest of the 4 tips are about. The things that we know from evidence-based science, if you do these things, the data suggests you really will get happier. So what are those things? And that gets us to top insight number 2. Top insight number 2 is that if we want to be like happy people, we need to make time for social connections. One of the most consistent findings in all of positive psychology is that social people are happier. Happy people make time to be with their friends. Happy people talk to strangers on the street. All the research suggests this enormous correlation between happiness and being social. But of course, that's just a correlation. Like, is it the case that being social makes you happier? Or is it just possible that if you're happy, you tend to be more social? We need to know causally, like if you force somebody to be more social, will they get happier? And that's just what a bunch of different studies have done, but maybe not in the way you think. Studies go out and they force people to be social, not with their best friends and family members, but with complete strangers on the street. One of my favorite studies that looked at this is by Nick Epley, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. And what he did was simply to ask folks to try to make a connection. Actually, first he offered them a $10 Starbucks gift card to be in the study, which everyone says yes, because $10 Starbucks gift cards are the engine of all social science research. So people say, yes, I'll do anything to be part of this condition here. And so Nick Epley basically makes people do one of 3 different conditions. In one condition, people are told that they have to make a connection. They have to have a conversation with somebody on this train. Complete stranger, talk with them for a couple minutes. Folks in a second condition were told, across this train line, just be solo. Like, just don't talk to anyone. Enjoy your solitude. Please don't speak to anyone for this train ride. And because Nick is a nerdy scientist, he also included a control condition where he told subjects to just do what they would normally do. Like, whatever you would normally be doing on the train, just keep doing that. And then he tested people's positivity after this. Nick also realizes that people's minds lie to them. And so I'm going to show you the graph that he reports in his paper. But before showing the actual condition, which is the one on the right over here, I'll show you what Nick found in his predicted condition, where he asks a different group of subjects just to predict how you're going to feel in these different conditions. And what he finds is that people tend to predict that this gray bar, the connection condition, that bar is not going to feel really good. It's not just going to be not positive, it's going to be actively negative, even though the solitude and the control condition feel really good. But what does he actually find when people engage with talking to a stranger? What he finds is the exact opposite. It's that white bar, the solitude condition, that feels kind of yucky. The connection condition feels really good. He's now gone on to show that this is true even across different personality types. This actual effect holds for introverts and extroverts. It's just that introverts really predict that talking to somebody is going to be worse, but they actually get a benefit from it just as well. And so this is top insight number 2, which is that we need to be making time for social connections if we want to be like happy people. Happy people have this down automatically. And if you're feeling not so happy, then forcing yourself to kind of be a little bit more social, whether that's with friends and family members, can be quite powerful. So now we get to top insight number 3, another thing that may be hard, but really seems to make us happy, which is that if we want to be like happy people, we should be making time for gratitude. Another very standard effect in positive psychology is that happy people tend to be more grateful. They tend to count their blessings in life. And so again, that's a correlation, but can we cause people to be happier simply by making them more grateful? And that's actually what lots of research by Bob Emmons and colleagues have done. Basically give folks a task where they have to list 3 to 5 things that they're grateful for at the end of the night. It's often called the 3 blessings condition. And what you find is that statistically within about 2 weeks, the simple act of experiencing gratitude in this way can bump up people's happiness, which is kind of surprising. But what's more surprising is the power of sharing your gratitude with other people. And that's what researchers who use things like a gratitude visit have done. You actually ask people to express their gratitude to another person. Here's just one version of that by Marty Seligman and colleagues. He has his subjects engage in what's called a gratitude visit. So in the next week, please write a letter of gratitude to someone who's helped you or been especially kind to you, but you haven't really properly thanked. And then deliver that letter in person to the person in question. What do people predict here? People predict that this is going to feel kind of awkward and weird and, be a little bit too emo, as my college students would say. But what happens in practice is that the people who receive these letters really love them. It's like not just a 10 out of 10 on a happiness scale, but it's like a really meaningful event for them. But what's more amazing is what happens to you, the person who's giving this letter. And that's the graph from Marty's paper that I'll show you here. He's plotting self-reported happiness. The white bar is going to be this gratitude visit versus a control where you just list a set of happy memories. And what he finds is that even though there's no difference before the test, you get a reasonable bump in happiness after the event. But what's incredible is that bump in happiness he finds lasts. And in his data, at least, it lasts statistically for about 1 month, which I find kind of crazy. That means there's a short intervention that you can do in, say, an hour today that could, in theory, statistically bump up your happiness for maybe over a month. And so that's your kind of homework from the Yale professor. This is your homework at midterm, or midterm of the class in your top 5 tips. Really think about who you could thank tonight. And try to do something that will bump up your happiness, maybe well into July sometime, well into the middle of summer. Okay, so that was tip number 3. Now we cruise on to top tip number 4, which is that if we want to be like happy people, we need to find ways to reduce our mind wandering and become a little bit more present. This is a hard thing in the modern day because we tend not to be present. We tend to spend a lot of our time mind wandering. This image is my favorite physical representation of mind wandering, right? Where we're not thinking of what it feels like to be in my body at this time. We're thinking about what we have to do tomorrow or that fight we had with our spouse or even the vacation that's coming up. We mind wander to positive and negative things, but the research suggests that all of those things we're mind wandering to don't feel really good. There's some fantastic work by the Harvard psychologist Dan Gilbert and Matthew Killingsworth that showed that not just that people mind wander a lot, but also that mind wandering kind of makes us feel a little yucky. They did this wonderful study where they ping folks and asked them a couple questions. First, what are you doing right now? Are you paying attention to what you're doing? And then third, how are you feeling? And what they find when people are asked these questions is that people self-report mind wandering a lot. Just under 50% of the time, people self-report that no matter what they're doing, they seem to be not paying attention to it. And that includes all kinds of activities. Gilbert reported even during sex, do people report that they're just simply not paying attention to it, which is bad enough as it is. But Gilbert and colleagues also found that all the times we're not mind wandering, we end up being less happy than the times when we're simply being present. like just in those moments where you're simply paying attention, no matter what the activity, we seem to be a little bit happier. And so to become happier, we need to find ways to curb this. We need to just simply pay attention to what's going on in the here and now. And so, how do we do that? Well, researchers have identified a couple different strategies. One is one that's just called savoring, which is simply the act of becoming present. It's especially useful if you're engaged in like a positive event like this one here, like, eating a delicious ice cream cone. But savoring is just thinking, what does this feel like right now? What does this taste like? What does my body feel like in this position? How would I describe this event to someone? It just forces you to become mindful in the present moment of the exact things that you're feeling and experiencing. And that can go a long way to making you notice those things, like actively assigning your attention to it. And that noticing, especially if it's a positive activity, can make you a little bit happier. But an even more powerful practice for bringing us into the present moment is this one, the simple act of meditation. There's been a lot of recent scientific interest in meditation and how it works. And that's in part because the research suggests that meditation is having some amazing effects on so many aspects of our cognitive system, from improving things like memory to making it clearer that we can attend more easily. It's kind of like going to the gym for your attention. But all of those things, the research suggests, help us reduce mind wandering. In fact, there's evidence suggesting that the simple act of meditating, even for very short bursts, in the data of folks like Hedy Kober at Yale and her colleagues, suggests that you can reduce activation in regions that tend to mind wander, the so-called default node network of the brain. And this can be really powerful because it suggests that the simple act of spending 5 minutes or so to focus on your breath can be one that allows you to mind wander less, even during tasks that you're facing in your daily life. So powerful techniques to get you a little bit more present. Okay, so that was top insight number 4. We need to reduce our mind wandering and become present. We're cruising through the rest of the class, getting to top insight number 5, which is that if we want to be happy people, we need to become wealthy, but not in terms of time. We need to do so in terms of money. This is the slide where I often wake my Yale students up where they say, oh, become wealthy. That's what I've been saying. It's like, no, not wealthy in the way you think, wealthy in a slightly different way. And that different way is what researchers like Ashley Willens at Harvard Business School has referred to as time affluence. We need to experience the subjective sense that we're wealthy in time. This is just the subjective feeling that you kind of just have a lot of time to do what you want. It's the opposite of what a lot of us experience, which is time famine. The problem is that we don't often prioritize our time. Often, rather than focusing on time, we're focused on money. But Willens and colleagues has found that this is not necessarily a recipe for happiness. She, in one paper, uses this very simple one-item individual difference measure. Are you more like the guy on the left or the guy on the right? So you're more often chasing after money, so you'll give up time to get more money, take more hours at work, not take your vacation time, and so on. Or are you more like the guy on the right, like where you'll really prioritize time over money? You'll make time-saving purchases that save you time doing tasks you don't want to do. You'll take your vacation and so on. And what she finds out of a simple happiness measure, these effects look small, but they're significantly different, is that people who tend to focus on their time end up being happier. And so if we want to be like happy people, we need to be focused a little bit more on maximizing our time affluence rather than our wealth affluence. How often do we focus on money, which isn't going to help our happiness, at the expense of our own time? Flipping that switch can be a huge boost in well-being that we don't even realize. Okay, so that was your quick 5 tips, big insights from the class. Before I end up talking to Rory, though, I kind of wanted to finish the story, which is that for my class, I was really hoping that I could introduce them to this evidence-based approach to happiness. And it was one that resonated on campus much better than I expected, which is really kind of encouraging. Like, again, my students, they don't seem to want platitudes. They want evidence-based approaches that they can use to change their behavior. They want to do that in the context of their savings and their economic choices, but they also want to do that in the context of their well-being. And so if I've convinced you that this approach is great and you want to learn more than this short 20-minute class, I'd encourage you to kind of follow the fact that a lot of people are interested in this. We got lots of attention for this first class, in part because I think this is an approach that a lot of people want. And so if you're like one of them, I encourage you to sign up for the free version of the Yale class that we now have on Coursera.org. It's called The Science of Wellbeing. You can check it out. And if that's not good enough, you can sign up for my podcast where you can get little bite-sized chunks of evidence-based approaches to improving your well-being. And with that, I will end and convince you, I hope, that the road to happiness is possible if you know the right evidence-based strategies. And now you have some that you can use. And with that, I will end. Express my gratitude to the Nudgestock crew, who are amazing to bring this out to all the folks in the world, and to thank you for listening.
Laurie, thank you immensely for that. It's both illuminating and slightly alarming in equal measure. Just a few questions.
I'm absolutely fascinated by that because, in a sense, the central insight of behavioral economics and social science, or one of the absolute core insights, is that our brains lie to us. And
Yep.
I'd understand, let's say I wrote a letter of gratitude to a former teacher of mine or something similar. I'd fairly well understand, I think, that they would be made happy by that. But it would be impossible for me, while writing that letter, not to see that as something that came as a cost to myself. And
Exactly.
yet, bizarrely, it's a little like the lesson of economics of Adam Smith, which is that actually two people can end up better off, that things aren't a zero-sum game. And yet, I can't think of a mindset I could get into where I would actually see my writing a letter of gratitude as a selfish act. I don't mean selfish in the bad sense of the word, but as an act with a benefit to me.
No, this is how we think of social connection in a lot of domains. This is true in work by Nick Epley and Liz Dunn and so on. We think that any kind of social connection or empathic act that we do for somebody else is like a happiness transfer, right? Like I'm doing something nice for you, but I'm taking some of my happiness, my time, or whatever, and I'm like giving it to you. That's the way our mind construes these events. But our mind is just completely wrong. In every known case of doing something pro-social, the person who's kind of doing the pro-social act, who's like doing something nice, gets almost as big of a hit of happiness as the person who's getting the act themselves. And
So
then they also get this reciprocal hit afterwards where it's like later on you often get, some reciprocal act from that person, right? And once you build up this social connection, it not only makes you happier, but it's kind of not a zero sum game. We're kind of getting something fun out of it later on too.
So interestingly, during this COVID crisis, one of the things which is similarly counterintuitive is the Benjamin Franklin effect, which is you like people whom you've done a favor for. On occasion, I've suggested this to commercial clients. I've said to an airline client of ours, look, strangely, if you asked people, don't make them do it, but I'll say, look, it would really help us out if you went on the 12 noon flight rather than the 10:30 flight. Strangely, those people would like you more through having done you a favor. But I've never got any traction because it seems so ridiculous. That there's
Yeah,
the assumption that there must be a cost to doing this.
yeah, I think that's right. And then then I think what happens with companies, right, is then they'll say, no, 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 what we'll do is we'll just force people to go on the, 12:10 flight. And that's actually a recipe for disaster. Now that, the passengers hate this company and so on. And I think this is really frustrating because I think, we're making our company's policies based on our own intuitions. And those are intuitions about, saving and, all the economic stuff we typically talk about in Nudgestock, but they're also intuitions based on our well-being, right? And if we could just get those practices more in line with what's going to work, it would help a company's bottom line, it would help their profits, it would help their customers feel better, and it would allow us to engage in these non-zero sum reciprocal relationships that build over time, right? Building up somebody's well-being makes them feel happier, and then they want to help more over time too. And so it's another case. I feel like in the positive psychology work, we're at the beginning of where we were, in 1980s behavioral economics with Kahneman, right? Where people are like looking at these things, be like, but like, loss aversion, like that violates my intuitions, like, like mental accounting, like, it has to be two different accounts. And like people are realizing, like, wait a minute, we're doing it wrong. The positive psychologists don't have the benefits of what formally behavioral economists did back in the 1980s. And I think that's kind of a problem. But we're really realizing that those intuitions are off too. And if we could better align our practices with those intuitions, not only will we get more profits, but you get folks just being happier generally, which would be an awesome win-win.
And I suppose the other thing which your students, many of them, must have noticed is this is a kind of vote of approval for religion, isn't it? These findings. So saying grace before a meal, for example, is an conscious act of gratitude. Meditation arises from, and prayer, I guess, is a kind of meditation, if you think of it like that.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, I think so much in cognitive science is just a way to realize that all the things that the ancients were telling us were true. I mean, I think that's true in typical behavioral economics, right? Like you want somebody to change their habits, have them do it for 40 days with social support, like Lent. Like we had that, right? For thousands of years before people figured out the science of habit change. I think the same is true for well-being. If you tick off religious practices, many of them focus on social connection, they focus on gratitude, they focus on making folks present. Like you're literally ticking off the things that researchers in positive psychology have said are important. And therefore, it's no surprise that on average, people who engage in religious practices tend to have a higher well-being than those that don't. And so, that doesn't necessarily mean that the religious beliefs are correct necessarily, but it means the practices that those cultural traditions had us engage in were kind of onto something. Like I think they've kind of undergone their own natural selection over thousands of years, and they sort of got behavioral science right beyond our intuitions.
Oh, that's fantastic. One question, which there may not be an answer to this, at least not an evidence-based one. How good a substitute do you think that, for example, video conferencing, what we're doing now, I wouldn't claim, even as a massive advocate and evangelist for those things, I wouldn't claim that it's 100% the same as being present. But how good, it's certainly better than email at one level, because you are paying attention to the other person's face. How good an approximation do you think it is to the real thing, if you like?
Yeah, I think there's more and more data coming out suggesting that it's a reasonable approximation, kind of if you do it right. What we're getting, you and I talking together right now, I'm seeing your facial expressions in real time. You're hearing the intonation in my voice. We can react to one another in real time, unlike we do over text or email, and all that's good. But it becomes bad if we do it in the way that we often do it, which is like, some of you watching this right now might be, only half paying attention. And the key is that if you just use the video conferencing in the same way that you would socially, it seems to work pretty well. But if you're doing other multitasking things, or kind of like, doing too much where you're just sitting in the chair all the time, like it can come with these negative features depending on how you do it. And so the key is really to get the good things out of the video conferencing, especially during this time of COVID, right? But kind of avoid some of the mistakes. And those mistakes would be, multitasking while you're doing it, doing it without any like exercise or moving around, look away from the screen and look up in the world every once in a while. If you can combine those healthy practices with it, it works pretty well, surprisingly well.
This is good to know. One of the disastrous things I always thought about telephone conferences was that they were a form of sensory deprivation. You had nothing to look at. So it was almost impossible for your mind not to wander. I had a colleague who actually took delivery of a flat screen television and mounted it on the wall during a client telephone conference. And so the fact that it's a reasonable approximation, that chimes with my instinct, funnily enough, because I was surprised how good it is at that.
Yeah, although I think it has the flip side of the kind of thing you were saying, which is that with phone conferences, there's nothing to attend to. So our minds are kind of bored. We want to do this other stuff. With Zoom, there can almost be too much to attend to. One thing is that we often can see our own image. As I'm talking to you, I can kind of look over at myself and I want to fix my hair. And, that's a kind of thing that we don't get in the real world. But even sometimes some Zoom calls are ones where they're like, hundreds of people are on there, right? And our eyes are used to scanning between facial expressions and taking them in a certain way, not all kind of at once with all the heads on the screen. And so I think these technologies are going to get better and approximate human cognition and human social interaction a little bit more. They're closer than a lot of people expect now, but there's of course still some improvement.
And then finally, I suppose, taking the first one last, the question of materialism, that materialistic people are less happy. The other finding on this was that there is a correlation between wealth and happiness, but it has surprisingly fast diminishing returns. Is that still borne out in the latest work?
Yeah, I think that's right. Again, the nuance is like, where does the diminishing return, cut off? And I think that that's based on like how much money do you need to like put food on the table, put a roof over your head, be kind of reasonable. But once you get there, you just don't get any more of a hit for your extra cash. And that's in part because so many of the behavioral effects that hit our happiness work worst for material possessions, right? Hedonic adaptation is worse for things that you buy that are going to stick around, that you get sort of bored with over time. And the idea is that we could probably get more of a positive hit for our money if we spent it right, but it's not spending it in the way we think. It's not buying stuff. It's, if anything, buying experiences. And it's
buying time.
Buying time, exactly. Lots of Ashley Willen's work suggests that time-saving purchases can be such a positive hit on your happiness that they're as good for your relationships, say, as having a partner who's a good listener. Having less time, if you don't spend your money on time, it can be as bad as the happiness hit of being unemployed. So buying time is huge. But finally, a lot of what we need to do with our money is to give it away, is to use it to do something nice for others. That seems to be the most positive hit we can have on our happiness. So that's not what we think is like, I'm going to get a huge salary just so I can give it away. But that's actually what the data suggests would work best.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And again, that fabulous lesson that it's a vital lesson in advertising, because we think we can essentially judge other people, and if we can't even judge ourselves, what hope have we got of making assumptions about what makes other people happy? I think that's incredibly revealing and fantastic. It's always a joy. I just should add that Laurie was at the very first Nudgestock in Shoreditch 7 years ago, and this is a triumphant return. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you back, albeit virtually. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much.
Fantastic.